Today I wanted to look at something that kind of scares me a bit because I know some of you are philosophers, others have worked in various areas of knowledge work, and what I have to say today is really very much a simplification of something that is much more complex than it appears on the surface, and yet it's a doorway in. And really, what we're looking about here is the fact that students are disciplinary foreigners. They're foreigners in our classroom in a number of ways. First of all, they recognize that you are the professor and they aren't. That's a bit of a daunting thing. The fact that a professor is there with a body of knowledge inside his or her head, and that knowledge is not in the student's head, immediately creates something like a power imbalance. And so that this sense of belonging isn't there as much because essentially, though you don't want to be, and I'm sure you want to be very friendly and everything, you're a bit alienating simply because of who you are. And the second thing is they don't understand the norms of the discipline. And so they really need to be enculturated. And so I want to look today at a model of disciplinary function and then look at how enculturation can happen within that. And I'm going to be very much of a talking head today. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to spend some time looking at it and then discussing the various ramifications of it. The first thing I think we need to understand is that a lot of our students don't even understand scholarship. They have no clear sense of what it means to be a scholar. They think of you as stuffy people in your offices, looking at ancient documents or whatever, and writing things and having long discussions, but they don't really get this sense of what is a scholar and what is scholarly literature. I've got a presentation in my the platform for this program called "What is Scholarship," and you can have a look at that. And it kind of walks through a process of trying to determine what it is that scholars do and what do scholars actually value. But for today, I want to look at disciplinary culture and try to get a sense of what is in there. Once again, very much an oversimplification. You may be appalled at how simplified this is, and yet I think it is a doorway into something. I look at three aspects of disciplines: epistemology, meta-narrative, and method. And I think with those three, we can cover a lot of ground. Epistemology, how we know what we know, or the study of our knowledge base. It relates to how our knowledge base forms over time. And that's really important because every discipline has a knowledge base that is valued, that is important, that is crucial to understanding how the discipline has formed itself by way of its content. And epistemology will look at things like, why does it include what it does? How do the various pieces of knowledge gain acceptance over time? And what is central as opposed to outlying knowledge? Every discipline has those outliers, those things that are sort of on target and yet not really accepted that well. The Association of College and Research Libraries has developed something called the Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education. And it's a series of threshold concepts that really define scholarship. And one of these that relates to epistemology is authority is constructed and contextual. And what we mean by this is that really the determination of authority is in the mind of the receiver of the information rather than the creator of the information. And you might say, well, no, authority, I mean, we're talking about religious studies, theology, church history, and biblical studies, and all of those things. We know where our authority is vested. It's vested in the scriptures. It's vested in the teachings of the church. And those things are absolute authority. Yet, think of the average teenager. You tell that teenager to do something and they say, no, I won't, or they just simply don't do it. And as far as they're concerned, the authority that you are trying to wield is not authority at all. They don't accept it. And because they don't accept it, it really does have no authority in their own experience. And that's why we have to think of authority as constructed and contextual. There's actually two levels of this. One is the level of the creator. We have to know that the creator is qualified to produce that kind of information. And we all know about the unevenness of information, and qualifications are very important. Whether the authority is biased in some way, has a vested interest in sharing something with us that might not be accurate. So authority is vested very much in who created the thing, but it's also contextual in the fact that the person receiving the information has to determine whether that information will be acceptable, whether it'll first of all be trustworthy, something that I can rely upon, something that I can use. And secondly, that in our context, it's relevant. I mentioned last week you can have a perfectly wonderful piece of scholarly writing that is totally irrelevant to the problem at hand, to what I'm looking at. And so everything goes through this process. And scholars have gone through this process as well for their knowledge base. They have determined that certain things are going to have credibility, they're going to stand the test of time, other things are going to be dismissed, other things are going to be discussed and debated forever, and nobody will really know for sure whether we should believe this or not believe this. But epistemology relating to the knowledge base is clearly important for scholars. They have to have an understanding of what it is that they know. And even though this is fluid and changes over time, it's a central concern to scholars. And so when you're teaching and you say, so-and-so has argued this, and there's been these opposing views, but we have some problems with them because of so-and-so, you're essentially exercising your epistemological sense of the knowledge base. The second thing is meta-narrative. And meta-narrative is one of these things that has really come under fire since the time of rise of postmodernism. Postmodernism, by the way, I call the Western luxury because most of the world doesn't have time to be postmodern. They have too many crucial concerns about survival, etc. But postmodernism, which has essentially argued that everything is subjective, that every experience is individual, when they hear the word meta-narrative, they kind of go ballistic because you can't talk about meta-narrative. It doesn't exist, at least not a single one. So what do I mean by meta-narrative? Meta-narrative is essentially an explanation for the narrative. The term meta meaning along with, or coinciding with, and then narrative. Our narrative in our own daily lives is what we do day by day. The things that happen. We got up in the morning, we did this, brushed our teeth, got in our car, we taught some classes, etc. That's our narrative. Our meta-narrative explains all of the other stuff, the kind of understanding of ourselves. Why do we do what we do? What is the overall sense of ourselves? Who are we? What drives us? What values do we have? What guides our narrative so that we do certain things and don't do other things? What are alternate voices and how do they help to shape our culture of ourselves? How do we discourse with one another? These are things that are our meta-narrative. They explain who we are in the context of our narrative. Meta-narrative is, I think, very important for disciplines because essentially it describes the culture of the discipline. Let me give an example. There's an old TV series called McHale's Navy, comedy series, and Tim Conway, who was kind of the doofus of the group, would love to listen to the expert sailors discussing technical details. And he would always say, gee, I love that kind of talk. And what he was doing, he was getting into the culture that defined those people, the kinds of things when they talked, the way in which they discussed things, the things they valued, the things they didn't value, were utterly important. If you think of any discipline, a discipline is built upon values of what is important about this? How do we govern ourselves ethically within this discipline? How do we guide our particular narrative to make sure that we are functioning well as a discipline? The idea of a discipline is really a construct. It's the fact that none of us can know everything, and so we specialize. And over centuries, various disciplines have evolved. But as they have, they've diverged from one another because they have a specific voice, a specific culture. A historian and a chemist have some things in common, but a lot of things that are not in common. If you say to a chemist, where are your primary sources? The chemist will say, well, I guess that's my experiments. And the historian, though, will say, well, my primary sources are the straight from the horse's mouth kinds of documents that we rely upon to help us understand history so that we can analyze it and make sense of it. And the way in which we think about our discipline, the way in which we value it, determines our culture. It kind of states the sort of cultural base that makes sense of what we do and why we do it. And then finally, there's method, and I guess that's probably the easiest one to understand. How do we advance our knowledge? What sorts of tools do we use in order to build our knowledge base, in order to test our assumptions? And method is informed very much by meta-narrative because the culture helps to shape the methodology, helps to make sense of it. And method interacts with epistemology as well. The knowledge base is used in the research and is something that is done by people who are practicing the discipline. And the method, when it's applied according to proper disciplinary principles, adds to the knowledge base. It may disrupt the knowledge base, it may challenge the knowledge base, but ultimately the knowledge base is shaped by the kind of methodology that we use in our discipline. Now, all of that is relatively foreign to students. Students who come into our discipline may have a rudimentary understanding of our topic, but once we start getting into the details, it seems really challenging. Why do theologians think the way they do? Why are philosophers like that? Why do they value this stuff? I don't see a purpose in it. I don't see what makes sense of it. And so these three elements, as we begin to help students to understand them, I think can help them to understand the discipline and maybe break down some of the walls between the disciplinary understanding that we have and the lack of disciplinary understanding in our students. I'd like to just open up for a minute here. Any questions about that basic foundational thing? Anything that you would like to throw out? If you want, you can totally discount everything I'm saying. This model makes no sense at all, but what do you think? Does that help us to make sense of how we would articulate the nature of our discipline to some extent? I'm sure there's some other elements, but at a basic foundational sense. Anyone like to comment, question? I don't want to just be the talking head all day. Okay, well, let's move a little bit further into this and see if we can get a sense of how we actually articulate those things. Now, I've got a platform that's a little broader, and it's listed in the readings on the right, in the right column on this part of the platform, and you can go there for more advanced readings. So here's just some basic things. For epistemology, ask, what is the most essential knowledge in the discipline? Now, this doesn't mean that you have a listing of major documents or anything like that, but you have a description of the nature of the knowledge base, primary, secondary sources, identity of leading scholars, and so on. Asking the question of why is is so and so so very important. You know, what's so good about Augustine? What's so good about Raymond Brown in biblical studies? Why would we pay any attention to these people? And that kind of question we often don't ask ourselves. We just simply assume, well, these are the good people. These are the people that have things to say. Thomas Aquinas and so on. But to actually ask yourself and then help your students to understand why these people are important, why this knowledge is important, why would we include this in our knowledge base and not that? And how did the knowledge base develop over time? Historical theology is a good place for this if you're doing theological stuff, because historical theology essentially is an analysis of the development of the knowledge base over time. And there it is. When it comes to meta-narrative, what motivates scholars in this discipline? I like the term motivation because I think it very much spells out meta-narrative. It gets to the heart of why scholars in the discipline do what they do, and it helps to define their shared purposes. What drives you as a disciplinarian? Why is it so important to you to be a philosopher or a theologian or any of the other disciplines? Another question is a challenging one. How diverse is this discipline's meta-narrative? Some disciplines are very much locked into a particular meta-narrative. Everybody seems to groupthink similar kinds of things. Other disciplines seem to thrive on having alternative meta-narratives. And biblical studies is a great example of that. Down through the centuries, there have been so many varied movements in biblical studies that have tried to do everything from close exegesis to reader response to philosophical approaches to the scriptures, to intertextuality. I've seen the Book of Job compared to Moby Dick, and so on. And as I look at this, I say, scholars may have diversions in their meta narrative, even though there's some things that are very close, that tie them all together. In biblical studies, for example, it's the text, it's the biblical text. You start there, and then you go from there. Anybody who says, well, we don't need the biblical text anymore to be a biblical scholar, is simply not going to be part of the discipline. It's just not going to work. Every discipline has its heart, its core of value, of the things that are the most important to us as we discourse, as we try to make sense of things. What is our purpose? What are our motivations? And then finally, method. What are the standard methods used by this discipline? And how do newer alternative methods gain acceptance in the discipline? And this is always an interesting one. Young scholars very often want to try out new methodologies, and they get shot down. They don't pass peer review when they want to publish something, because people say, well, that methodology isn't what we do in this discipline. We don't do that sort of thing. And if they do get published, they often become a target of other people. I think of C.H. Dodd, who brought up some wonderful ideas and used a variety of methodologies to come up with some brilliant new things. And every time he did, there was some hotshot young scholar ready to write the latest paper, absolutely destroying C.H. Dodd. He was attacked constantly through his entire career. And now his stuff is seen to be much more mainstream. So somehow it did gain acceptance, even though it wasn't at first. So how does that happen? How do things grow and develop? What we're doing overall here is trying to help students to understand how our discipline ticks, how it works, what it is that is important to us by way of knowledge, how we think and how we exercise our ethics and values and purposes, and how we carry out our method. When students begin to understand that, they begin to start to feel a little bit more at home. I spent a couple of years in Africa teaching at a theological school. And when I first got there, I felt like I'd landed on the moon. I didn't, the common language was English in the country, but beyond that, everybody thought differently from me. Everybody did things differently. The whole culture was so very, very challenging to me. And over time, as I was invited into that culture, I began to understand it. And I began to understand its knowledge base, and I began to understand the methods that people use in common discourse to advance in the society. It takes time. And we have to keep our students away from the idea that they are aliens and foreigners. We want them to be part of our disciplinary discourse and understanding. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with research? It really has everything to do with research. We all know those strange papers that we get from some students who don't seem to have a clue how research is done in our discipline. Or they struggle to try to imitate other scholars and really don't do a very good job of it. And it's like they really don't understand what this discipline is about, what's important in this discipline. And so for students to begin to become good researchers, they really have to have a solid understanding of how our discipline works. So any questions at this point before I move into practical ways that we can use to get there? Any questions?
May I? What are some primary sources for history, for writing history papers?
Okay. It depends on what kind of history you're talking about. As far as history is concerned, history is highly reliant upon primary sources, but they can vary. If you're dealing with ancient history, of course, you're looking at ancient documents. Church history, you may be looking at the fathers, you may be looking at, Aquinas, or you might even be looking at fairly modern theologians. I once did a historical work on a denomination in my own area, British Columbia, and in a 1912 book, I found a first-person account of the person who had developed the first denominational church of its kind in my area back in between 1905 and 1910. And he talks about the way in which he developed this church. Well, that's a primary source. He was the guy, he did it. And a great value for history. So it varies a lot. As far as teaching students to do research in history, there are lots of specific tools that books that teach students about the values of history, and there are also a lot of books that the kind of what is history kind of books that can help students to acculturate to historical research, historical understanding.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Does this make sense to you? Does this work? To kind of hang your hat on three specific elements. They're not all the elements in the discipline, but they're kind of foundational. The knowledge base and how we understand that, our culture, and then our method.
And I guess I appreciate your grin, and I think it is important that the meta-narrative part. I'm a theologian teaching theology, and it just makes me think about it's so important. That's such an important aspect of theology, is presenting your own orientation. In theology, in a way, you can look at theology as a group of factions, in Catholic theology.
Yeah, I'm missing a little bit of that last part of what you were saying there.
Theology, you can say theology is a group of factions, I mean, you use Catholic theology within a larger Christian theology, but within Catholic theology there are so many ways of approach. And it just, what you're saying brings that to my consciousness in a particular way that when, certainly for me, part of my teaching is orienting my students. This is where I come from. This is what I suggest. Be careful over here. This line is going to have that orientation. But
Yeah.
also, there's an encounter part because the students come, some students anyway, many students come with their own orientation or their fears or their, preconceptions. When I was a student, we'd say the heretic hunters, There's the student who's afraid you're coming from this orientation or that, or suspicious of an orientation. And sometimes you want to counteract that, or open up the student's mind. And sometimes I say, focus here. So I just wanted to make that comment that certainly from a theology point of view, I think that aspect of the meta-narrative that you're bringing in is really important. I don't have the answer. I just know I live those questions all the time. How much do I, channel the students toward an orientation I think is sound and try to protect them from something else, and how much do I try to open them, to a broader view?
Yeah. That is a challenge primarily because students, I find most students are inherently pretty conservative when they come into our environment. So their background is really important to them. And they have this sense of, I know what I believe, and I'm a little concerned that you might not believe what I believe. I think the advantage with looking at it from the standpoint of meta-narrative and epistemology and method is that you can show students how you do things, how things happen within your discipline, and perhaps get them to understand that while you might differ on particular interpretations of things, there are methods that can be used to evaluate, to test, to check things out. And certainly the meta-narrative of a Catholic theologian is not going to be the same meta-narrative as a Baptist theologian, for example. And you may have a different sense of epistemology, particularly with Catholic theology, with the history, the tradition of the church may not be as important to a Baptist theologian. But I think if we understand our own meta-narrative, we can better address students who are coming in with a different meta-narrative and help them to understand, where we are, and perhaps try as much as possible to understand their meta-narrative as well, and see if you can find a meeting of minds. Now, sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes a student will simply say, I think most of what you're saying is off the wall, is not proper. And of course, the H word is always there, heresy, but I think if we can help students to understand the overarching meta-narrative of a discipline, and then the particular aspects of it that relate to our own teaching, I think we have a better understanding of helping that can give them a better understanding of where we're coming from and how they can fit into that. And certainly we need to understand where students are coming from, because that can be a real challenge sometimes.
So, Bill, I think a good example of that might be with what Bible translations we recommend. And, we can tell them, here's what we recommend. And I think we can tell them, here's why, like we favor the literalness of this one. Or, someone might favor another one because it's more inclusive language, but we can tell them kind of the basis that we have for favoring certain translations.
It's interesting you should say that. Our pastor on Sunday, who's a young guy, he's under 30, very, very intelligent, very well read, very, very clear in his theology. He held up his Bible and he said, I know that you're going to find this to be absolutely abnormal and terrible, but I need to tell you that this is not the inspired word of God. And there's a little gasp, and then he said, but it is the word of God. And what he was saying was, our translations are ways of interpreting, understanding what the original sources had to say. And all of them do their best to try to understand that. Most of them are very close to what the biblical text is saying, but none of them are perfect, which is why we have various translations. And just simply doing that, he helped to discount the idea that you should grab your, King James or your whatever, and say, this is it. Everything else is heresy. If you have different words in your Bible, it's wrong. And so he was essentially, talking about some of the insider stuff in a discipline, the recognition that our translations are as close approximations as possible to the original meaning, but they're not the original text. And so there it is. And, he affirms the authority of the Bible very much so, but recognizes that it's a translation that we're working with. So any other questions or comments? Okay, something I'd like to do is to begin to look at how in the world can we begin this process of disciplinary enculturation. How can we get our students to understand our disciplines more like insiders than outsiders? And one of the things that I think is really, really helpful, and it's easy for us to do. This is not a major disruption of our classes or anything like it. It might take a little time in one class, but it's to exercise the power of autobiography. Students, as they're trying to make sense of who we are in the classroom and what we are about and what this whole discipline is about, we can talk about ourselves. We can explain our own journey, our own experience. And some of the things you could say, explain is, how did you get into this field of study? What intrigued you about it? What were the obstacles you faced in becoming a member of your discipline's community? At one point, you didn't feel like you belonged here. Now you do. What obstacles did you overcome? What are your most important values in doing the work of your discipline? There's an important one. I really believe in values. I think they govern so much of what we do. What is the importance of working with and following the work of your colleagues? Why pay attention to other people? Why work with them? Why consult? Why discuss and debate? What are the research practices that are most important to you? What methodological and ethical lines will you not cross? There's an interesting question. What will you not do as a theologian or a, whatever? How does your discipline advance itself? How does it move forward? What causes it to move forward? And how would you explain your discipline's culture? If someone were to say, what is the culture of your discipline? What is it like? Those are some key questions, and you can really build a narrative for yourself. Let me give an example from myself. I started wanting to become a psychologist. So my undergraduate education was in psychology, and I had a problem getting into graduate schools simply because of the baby boom. There were just so many people for so few posts. I was going to have to wait a bit. So I thought I'd go to a seminary and see if I could get a counseling degree through that. And wouldn't you know it, the seminary that I applied to and got accepted at didn't really have a very good counseling program. And so I moved more into the area of theology, thinking, well, maybe I'd like to teach. So I got a Master of Divinity and Master of Theology, enjoyed it a lot. Went to Africa, taught there, ran their library because nobody else wanted to, and came back and started teaching. And I realized teaching is just too stressful for me. I can teach a course, but when I have to teach a full load and do all that stuff, it just became really stressful, and I wasn't happy. And then all of a sudden, a library position opened, and I was offered the opportunity to go off and get my Master of Library Science and come back and become the librarian. And I realized all through my life, I had been looking at information and knowledge and had been trying to impart that information and knowledge to other people, and that a library role would really give me an opportunity to become kind of a nexus between people seeking information and the information itself, so that people would get the right information that they needed, and that they would learn the methods that they needed in order to acquire information for themselves. And all of a sudden, everything clicked. It is so very important for me to be someone who stands in the gap between people and the knowledge that they need. And that really is at the heart of a librarian's culture, to stand in the gap there, to reach out to students or to others, whoever we're working with, to enable them to fully embrace, acquire and use and evaluate the information base that they have. And so that became the heart of what I am as a librarian. And I can explain that. I can explain how the library knowledge base develops over time, and there's lots of information there. We don't like to talk about ourselves. It's not, hi, I'm Professor so-and-so, and here's everything you need to know about me and all my accomplishments, etc. But if you take it from the standpoint of, this is why I am here in this classroom in front of you teaching so-and-so, 534. I'm doing it because I am passionate about this subject. And why am I passionate about this subject? Here's my story. This is how I got into this. And this is what's important to me. That is a very easy thing to do. It's also a great way of introducing yourselves to students, opening yourself up to, perhaps some of the struggles you had as you went through graduate school, and the times that you felt like you should give up, but you carried on because this was important to you. And now you're teaching it because it's important to you, and it should be important to your students as well. That kind of thing becomes an invitation. Have any of you used autobiography like that in your classes? Maybe this is a common thing to you. I know we're all kind of self-effacing when it comes to talking about ourselves. We'd rather talk about our subject matter, but we are embodying that subject matter to our students.
I use it when I'm trying to explain to the students how I work from both literature and psychology and how that ever came to happen, and so that helps them understand the perspectives I'll be taking in the course too.
Yeah. That's great. And of course, you can share your passion in doing that, so that students realize that this is really an important field, and has vital concern for you. Any other things?
Bill, I have a question, and this actually came up just listening to your autobiography. When you, this state of library science right now, I'm sure looks a lot different than when you originally got into it, because of how fast technology changes. And then also with like COVID happening and a lot of things going online. I'm just curious what your thoughts are regarding like the direction things are headed with library science, and how that could affect the classroom as things continue in this direction with the development.
Yeah, when I started, we were typing catalog cards on sheets of paper, corrugated, or not corrugated, but paper that could be torn in squares, and sending them off to be photocopied. Then we type headings on the top, and we'd file the cards in the card catalog. That's ancient history. That's where I started. And since then, of course, the computer has come, and digital. And this has been an absolute boon, I think, for us during the time of COVID, to be able to have those electronic resources available to our students. Theological education is becoming more and more global, and I don't know if it's the same thing with your students, but Christian education in general is becoming a thing where a lot of our participants are at a distance. They're not with us, or even if they are with us, they're not on campus all the time. And so we're, developing more electronic means of teaching, remote learning, etc. And I think the move towards electronic resources in particular has been good on a couple of fronts. First of all, the finding tools are way, way more powerful than the old religion index 1 in print form or psychological abstracts in print form. And believe me, I've used those things. And now we have, PsycInfo and Atla Religion Database. The power of those things to reveal literature is profoundly better. And the second thing is that we can disseminate our knowledge, our information, books, journals, to a much wider audience in many different places at the same time. And I know all of us kind of cringe at the thought of print becoming less important, because there's nothing like holding a book in your hand and turning the pages. We all know that. But I think for us, just being able to get the knowledge to our students effectively is more important. For professors, it's also very, very possible now to post a lot of things online behind login, scripts, so that students can read things that perhaps they were not able to read before. And so we can post things and build our reading base and have that stuff available. And so I think the direction of libraries is moving forward. I don't think we've lost any of the rigor of theological Christian librarianship and all of the values that we have with that. We're still trying to connect students with the best resources possible, help them to understand how to use those resources properly. But I'm really quite encouraged by the future of all of this. I don't think it's been a dumbing down exercise at all. I think it's simply been a way of expanding our access, which is terrific. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I wanted to move on to something else, which is something you probably do at certain points, and that's close reading. Close reading is the kind of thing where you and your students together read something, a writing, and try to really get a sense of what this thing is about by paying particularly close attention to it, so that you are looking at, not just what's being said, but how it's being said, and so on. Close reading can be a really, really good tool for disciplinary understanding. If you've got a particular piece of writing done by somebody that you consider important, to walk your students with it, through it, not just for content, but for values and for process. So what you do with this kind of approach is you do close readings, or you assign close readings that look at the author's structure. How did the author structure this piece of writing? Method and underlying values. And so look at, how does this person present the essential problem to be addressed? It's do they lay it out at the beginning? Do they let you kind of guess it as you go along? How do they shape their structure? How do they develop from point A to point B to point C, etc.? How do they use evidence? How do they shape their conclusions? With the use of evidence, what evidence is missing? I love this with Bible commentaries. Some commentators don't want to get into certain things. There's some area of controversy and they don't want to get into it. And so they blithely pretend that it doesn't really exist as a problem, and they just go on. And that can be really frustrating. But if you can walk through what an author is saying to the reader and how the author is developing that, the kind of argumentation that's used, the evidence that's presented, the way in which conclusions are made, the overall values, that can really, really help your students to get a sense of what writing in that particular discipline looks like from a disciplinary standpoint. A biblical paper is going to be different from a theological paper, from a psychological paper, or whatever. They are going to be different. They're structured differently. The kind of evidence they find important is different, and the kind of argumentation they make is different. And if you can do this, you can share content with students. You can use this as a content piece, but you can also share how the author did it. How did it work? How did it function as something that the author, felt was important? I wrote a paper a number of years ago looking at the question of the baptism of Jesus. And my question was Jesus a disciple of John the Baptist? Which seems on the face of it to be a fairly strange question. How would he be a disciple of Jesus? But I shaped it in such a way that I think I captured something of what biblical scholarship is about. And I have students read it, and they challenge me all over the place, and they look at my evidence, and I think, isn't that wonderful? They're actually looking at how I thought through this process, and they're seeing where they consider there to be problems and where they're not. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they've done this kind of close analysis. And you can present something to your students and say, analyze this and answer these questions, and shape the questions in such a way that they get into the heart of what the writer was trying to do here, and what the methods were. And that, I think, is really a crucial way of going with regard to understanding disciplinary culture. The writing of that culture comes out in close reading, if you make sense of it that way. Reading for process rather than content seems to be a bit of a strange sort of thing. It's like a magician's trick. There's a difference between what did the magician do in the trick and how did the magician do it. And we're always trying to get at how they did it. But in our reading, we should also be having students try to analyze how the scholar in that discipline did it. What were the tools that were used, the processes, the values that were expressed? I remember reading Andre Lecoq talking about the Apostle Paul as a man of his times, a backward person who didn't really understand the way the world worked and how everything was going to change after him. And I thought, oh, that makes me angry, you're talking about Paul that way as a backwards person. But as I began to understand Lecoq and his methodology, I realized that his own meta-narrative was quite distinct from my own, and it helped me to understand my own a little better. And so there it is. That kind of reading can really be helpful when you look at process rather than content. Any comments on that? I'm just hoping I'm making some kind of connection here with regard to this. Does this model work for you? I think so often we're so busy doing the work that we don't often think about the underlying. Okay, I'd like to finish off. I've got some exercises and readings here for those of you who are doing the certification. You can do the reading that's at the top of 1, 2, and 3. I've got some additional readings, though, that I think might be helpful. I have a slide presentation, disciplinary thinking and research processes, that you might find helpful. I did a book chapter in an Atla Press book. This is an open access press called Framing Information Literacy Within the Disciplines of Theological Education. And out of that, I created a guide called Disciplinary Enculturation, and there's a link to that. As well, I've got a paper, Student Theological Research as an Invitation. And then finally, an older work that I did, secular work, with Robert Farrell from City University of New York, called Situating Information Literacy in the Disciplines, a Practical and Systematic Approach for Librarians. I think you'll find some useful things there. Okay. Does this sound like something that you could use in your classroom without a lot of disruption of what you're teaching? Something you could maybe infiltrate into the things you're teaching? What do you think?
Sure.
Any ideas of how you would do this in a regular course?
I would
Yeah.
say a lot of disruption. I think it would take a lot of time to go through a typical scholarly article in a class. So I'm very curious about the prompt you developed. I sort of want to steal it, to be honest, or borrow it.
Yeah.
I'm always struggling. When I do this, I tend to select an article that's not quite scholarly. So it's not reflective of what I hope they do, but the length sort of facilitates sort of a classroom exercise. And it might,
Yeah.
especially if I'm teaching on ground. I think if I'm teaching online, then I'm more walking them through it, which probably is a different experience, but I think it's especially valuable if we're going through it in the class. So any thoughts on how to address that and recommendations for using parts of, because parts of don't quite convey it either.
Yeah, you can use parts of if you have specific ideas of things that you want to cover. For example, looking at how a scholar presents a problem to the reader, so that generally it's up front somewhere, so that the reader knows this is what this article is going to be about. This is the kind of thing we're trying to address. How is that done? You could look at just the evidence that's presented, and try to evaluate how the evidence is presented, show the method that the scholar is using, and that can work as well. The alternative, of course, is to make this an assignment, so that students have an assigned reading rather than just the content. You can say summarize the argument of the author, and then from that point on, how does the author develop a problem? What kinds of evidence does the author use? State the evidence that is there. How significant do you believe that evidence to be? How does the author frame a conclusion? Do you think that the author has been fair to the evidence, has left things out, has done things with it that are not legitimate, or do you believe that this is a good piece of scholarship? And then comment on the student's paper, and perhaps offer some suggestions as to ways to look at it that might differ from what the student thought. So if we don't introduce students to writing in our discipline, they can't really be expected to write in our discipline very effectively, because they don't have any models that really work for them. And you don't want a bunch of, in my opinion, and that idea doesn't work for me kinds of stuff. No matter what discipline it is, this doesn't work.
I like the idea of doing the close reading, though, because I find a fair number of my students, they have a hard time kind of getting what the main point of an article is, and so trying to focus on a paper, it's often diffuse and not narrow enough, and so helping them see, and read through together with the paper. It takes time, but I do find it worthwhile to make sure they're understanding the key points.
And you can help use it to build the content base too, if you could find something that's relevant to whatever content you're teaching, so that you don't lose a lot of time, that you would rather spend on content. Throughout these workshops, I'm trying to look at ways in which you can do this sort of thing without really mangling the kinds of stuff that you actually need to do. And, the worst thing is for me to suggest a bunch of radical ideas, and you say, well, that would never work in my class because I don't have the time for that kind of stuff. This should be stuff that you could have the time to do within your framework. Particularly the autobiography thing can be done in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And it might be a very good way of introducing the class and what you're going to be doing. So it could be very useful. I need to remind you as well, there's no class next week. And then we'll start again the following 4 weeks. So there's no session next week. And then there's 4 of them in June. Any other questions or comments before we conclude? This is pretty far from show them the databases, but I think it's really, really important for students to start here to understand the discipline they're working in, at least to some extent.
Oh,
So I think
I'm sorry, Bill. Just the reading lessons. I wasn't clear about.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I jumped in late today.
Yeah, that's in the platform that you have for this course.
Okay.
Under enculturation, the right column has the stuff that people for certification want to do. And there's also just a bunch of other readings if you want to get into this in a little more depth. I've been working on this a long time, so I've developed a lot of stuff. I'm not sure how important or relevant it is, but I've been writing about this for a long time, since at least 2010. So
Yep.
yeah, 11 years now.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Great. Well, have a good break, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, Lord willing, and we'll start again.
God bless.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.